The one constant, for me having done this, for many years, there's always change in Washington.
Welcome to Season 7 of Bridge the Gap, a podcast dedicated to informing, educating, and influencing the future of housing and services for seniors. Powered by sponsors AccuShield, Align, Nick Map Vision, ProCare HR, Sage, Hamilton Captel, ServiceMaster, The Bridge Group Construction, and Solinity, and produced by Solinity Marketing.
Welcome to Bridge the Gap podcast, the senior living podcast with Josh and Lucas. We got a great friend and a returning guest on. You guys get to hear from Dave Schless of ASHA. Welcome back to the program.
It's a pleasure. Always enjoy my time with you and appreciate having a chance to visit again.
Absolutely. We are, obviously preparing here at the end of the year. You're preparing to host a great membership meeting, a winter membership meeting. It's going to be January 27th through the 29th, 2025. It's amazing to be talking about 2025 already, right? It'll be the annual meeting taking place in Arizona at the Biltmore in Phoenix. I'm excited about that. Dave, I hope that you can do something about the weather, because I remember last time we were there, the popsicle golfers coming back in frozen from being on the frost-filled golf course in Arizona. What was that all about?
I'll say this: we have had probably 6 or 7 annual meetings at the Arizona Biltmore. It's a very unique property. It was, I believe, the only hotel that Frank Lloyd Wright designed. So it's a really terrific property. But generally speaking, there are worse places to be than Phoenix in late January. So I'm an optimist by nature. I think we're going to be good on the weather front. Certainly hope we don't see frost again.
Likewise, yes. You always pick great locations. I really do look forward to the travels to get to the annual membership meeting. And, we do hope it is a little bit warmer there than other places. And, speaking of heating up, you're there in DC. There's a lot going on in transition. ASHA has always been I would consider the top advocate for senior housing. And you've been at this so many years through so many different administrations. There's always good and bad, no matter what is behind their names. And ASHA carries the mantle and the flag to advocate for senior housing. As the year comes to an end and we start this transition in 2025, what do you think the challenges and opportunities are with a new administration? And what is ASHA going to be focused on in the upcoming years to help promote and advocate for senior housing?
The one constant, for me having done this, for many years, there's always change in Washington, and, the House of Representatives every couple of years. Obviously, the Senate, the elections are staggered, and so there's just this constant need to build relationships on Capitol Hill with new representatives, new senators, new staffers. So we're it's a never-ending process for us, and that in part is really central to what we do. We have that focus. We don't have the state affiliates. So we're really solely focused on federal policy. And, obviously we were watching, as everyone was, the recent election. Obviously, we know President Trump, and, and certainly while there's still a few races that haven't yet been called, the Senate flipping to Republican control, definitely I think is going to we'll be facing different issues, probably reduced pressure in certain respects on the Senate side. Obviously, this past year we spent a lot of time dealing with a variety of different bills that were introduced primarily by the two Massachusetts senators, both Democrats, Senator Warren and Senator Markey, kind of reactionary legislation that would have really if enacted, would have had just profoundly negative consequences for all healthcare. I mean, they were bills that really would have, had a chilling effect on investment from private equity and REITs in very broadly defined categories of healthcare. And so, again, with the different Congress, the Republicans taking over, doesn't mean that those issues go away. It means that, Senator Warren, Senator Markey won't be as, they won't have as much prominent leadership on an issue like that. So that, I think that we'll continue to work on that. It's an issue that, probably won't go away. But, to a large extent, the Republicans controlling the Senate probably makes that less front and center than it would have otherwise been, if the Democrats held on to the Senate. Ultimately, next year, obviously we need to see, who's chairing various committees and, agencies. So there's a lot we don't know yet. I think it's safe to say next year will be a tax year. So the number of expiring tax provisions from the last major tax legislation, which was enacted during the President Trump's previous term. So that will probably take up a lot of energy. And, that's an area for us where, we have to be very focused because, very minor changes to the tax code, potentially have very significant consequences. And so in that last tax bill, there was some language that the way it was written, we had some concerns about whether senior living would be able to continue to deduct business interest. And so we were concerned enough about it to get something into the Senate record, ultimately the legislative record, and that was something called a colloquy. And that was essentially the chair of the Senate Finance Committee, Orrin Hatch, with Senator Lankford, who was a member of the Senate Finance Committee, reading into the legislative record very specifically that that congressional intent was to include senior living in the definition of real estate for purposes of the deductibility of business interest. But I just pointed out because those are things that, again, senior living would be very disadvantaged if somehow legislation was passed and the tax treatment was different for senior living than, say, for apartments or hotels or other types of real estate. So it requires a lot of attention and focus, and again, there'll be that will be the focal point, I think, of a good deal of the legislature next year. Obviously, we're still kind of waiting to see who controls the House, and that'll dictate some of the horse trading that will go on. But big tax year in 2025. I think we can definitely anticipate that.
Dave, that's a lot of information, and our some of our listeners that may not fully understand, how much the advocacy piece, how much time that takes. And you mentioned, it seems like constant change in Washington, and whether that's every couple of years, every 4 years, there's always these changes. And I imagine that presents a really difficult challenge to build relationship and candidly to have some influence in the educational aspect for what sometimes seems to be these knee-jerk or reactionary sort of impulses to legislation and bills. What does that really look like with boots on the ground for ASHA when you're not only trying to learn who these people are, get in to see them, I would imagine, build a relationship to inform and educate them, I mean, how long does that process take? I could see that by the time that you feel like you're getting somewhere with these individuals, it's already turning over. So that's just kind of feels like a revolving door for you guys, doesn't it?
It's an ongoing process. It never, it never ends. I always say this, not, I'm exaggerating probably a little bit, but, we're really up on the hill almost every day of the year. And even, when members of Congress are back home in their state or in their districts, a lot of times we're still up on the hill. So it's an ongoing process for us. It's a bipartisan process. I mean, we're obviously focused on the committees that touch, senior living, and some more so than others. But yeah, it's a never ending process. And, look at in some situations over time, you really have an opportunity to, change someone's perspective if they had a negative perspective about senior living over time. There are opportunities to, really educate and tell our story. And I mean, at the end of the day, that's really, what we're all about. And that's, for us, obviously, we have a seniors housing political action committee, and that provides us access. It doesn't influence anyone's vote, but we need to be in front of the members of Congress and their staff, and that's just an ongoing process. Obviously, some of it we do with our members. We took a whole bunch of folks up to Capitol Hill following the NIC conference in Washington, D.C. this year. And so, yeah, I mean, it's an ongoing, process. And then we have some members that are on their own, involved politically, and so those are really also very helpful. I mean, to getting to know members of Congress and their staff. And certainly we do a lot of work with other organizations, the AIM, which is not a direct affiliate of the Alzheimer's Association, but they do a lot of advocacy related to Alzheimer's research. And certainly Argentum, Silver PAC, and American Healthcare Association. But yeah, it's constant. I mean, it is constant. And again, for us, we don't have the state affiliates, so that we have that focus, and both the ASHA legislative team, and then we work with outside lobbyists as well. And certainly like this, following an election, there's going to be a lot of new people, a lot of new staffers, and just a lot of change coming.
The work that you guys do is phenomenal, and it's good for our audience to know that that's an every day of the year function. A lot of times people just think about the awesome events that you guys put together for your membership and partners to the industry, which is what we do want to get to. We want to talk about that, because everything we have just been talking about makes this year's annual meeting in January, the 27th and 29th, even that more pivotal and important for members to unite around, because I'm sure many of the challenges, obstacles that our industry faces, as well as the opportunities that we can talk about and celebrate some wins together as well, is going to happen in January. It's always something that me and Lucas and the Bridge the Gap team look forward to, and appreciate your partnership and us being able to share with our listeners some of the awesome thought leaders that attend this event. So we're going to be out in Arizona. Can you give us some highlights of what attendees and the partners to the industry could expect to see this year?
What I always like to say, just kind of setting the stage. So if you've never been to an ASHA meeting, it is probably a little bit unique. We have, I think, really always tried to, keep kind of a balance of, opportunities to, interact with other industry leaders, in both receptions and like outdoor activities. So Arizona lends itself obviously to golf, and I know we'll be doing a group hike, and I think we've got pickleball again. Pickleball is popular, so we like those opportunities to let people really get to know other industry peers and industry colleagues, and that's always been really important to us. And then obviously you've got the receptions and the more formal part of the meeting, but we really like that. We think that's a really important ingredient in these meetings. Obviously, the meeting in January, it's nice because it's kind of the kickoff to the new year, and so we try and cover a range of topics at the annual meeting. We have a really an amazing keynote speaker that we're really excited about. We've got Rob Kaplan, who is the vice chair of Goldman Sachs, and Rob Kaplan had been the president CEO of the Dallas Federal Reserve Bank, had a very lengthy, illustrious career at Goldman Sachs, taught at Harvard Business School for a bunch of years, but just again, in terms of capital markets, the economy, he's really got his pulse on what's going on. And, as for ASHA, I mean, the capital, well, for any of our meetings, I mean, the capital piece of this is just so integral. I mean, it's really it is just a crucial piece of these meetings. So we're really thrilled to have Rob Kaplan with us in January at the annual meeting to deliver the keynote presentation. Kind of sticking with that topic. I mean, as you both know, we always cover capital markets in these annual meetings. So we'll also have really, I think, a terrific panel that will get into more of the industry specific capital discussion, capital valuation trends. That'll be moderated by Matt Whitlock of Berkshire Residential Investments, with Colleen Blumenthal of Health Trust, Tim McHugh of Welltower, and Kurt Reed of RSF Partners in Dallas. So that's a really really terrific panel, and so we think we'll cover those issues really well. We also, I think, have always tried at the annual meeting to have kind of a CEO type discussion that really allows the moderator to cover a lot of different topics, from operations to occupancy, development, just so many different topics. And so that'll be moderated this year by our chair, Kathy Sweeney, Blue Moon Capital Partners, and she's got Cindy Bear from Brookdale Senior Living, Justin Hutchins from Ventas, and Richard Hutchinson from Discovery Senior Living. So cover a lot of senior housing properties across that group. But Kathy's a fabulous moderator. So I'm sure that will be a really insightful discussion. I always like to say, I think the moderator is frequently the most important part of any session, because you really have to be willing to prepare for the session and ask good questions and follow-ups. Kathy is a fabulous moderator, so really excited about that particular session. We always like to also do some breakouts where we have kind of smaller, break into smaller rooms and allow people to maybe interact a little bit more than they can in the big sessions. And so we'll have a session that'll talk about public policy. Again, we talked a little bit about that, but we'll have Jean McGlynn Delgado, who heads up our policy team. She'll be leading that breakout session with Michelle Kelly from National Health Investors, who is our seniors housing PAC chair, and has gotten, really involved in our policy as well. We'll do a session that'll focus on partnering with healthcare providers and senior living. So again, a topic that, we're really interested in, and we know there's a lot of different approaches, and, we've got I think a really good panel. And again, we'll have Alan Fairbanks from Servium Care Network. And, Alan spent many years, of course, on the operating side with Bickford. So he's got a really unique perspective. Servium Care Network, really interesting, and I think definitely I'm a fan of what they're doing, and I think they're going to do really great things for their for the industry and for their partners. We've got Larry Gumina from Ohio Living, not-for-profit, very involved in in a different way with the perennial plan. So they're actually in a kind of in a risk-bearing plan with their partners. Also real thoughtful. And then we've got Mark Price, the CEO of Curana, who also is just has a very wide range of interests in this space, a very unique perspective on, value-based care and older adults in different settings. So I think that's going to be a really great discussion. We've got a breakout session that'll focus on marketing and sales. Again, something that, we don't always cover, but it's just such an important topic. And it, for us, it really is, touches upon what we're trying to do with our Where You Live Matters effort. But, really, we'll talk about a lot of different things. Christy Vander Westhuizen of Legend will moderate that session. We've got Heather Fremont with Maplewood Senior Living and Eric Varon of the Aspenwood Company. So both, really terrific, seasoned professionals. So that should be a really good discussion. And then, we have our legal operations breakout session. We always try and find sessions that are really practical. And, there's just this intersection of, legal issues that are really hard sometimes. And then someone's, they're hard to understand for anyone. And I know, because I try and understand them. And then, then someone's got to actually interpret them and, make them work, the reality of, operations. And so, this will be a session that will kind of talk about some of those really challenging issues that sometimes aren't really as clear cut or as black and white as, as they maybe should be. But we have a really good panel. So we've got Christian Holland, who's with SRG out of California, Allison Ramirez, who's with Bridge Investment Group, and she chairs ASHA's legal committee. And then we've got Kathy Levy, who is the president and chief operating officer of Generations, which is based in Oregon. So I know that's going to be I know they're going to cover some really important topics. I'm particularly interested in that discussion, and there are a lot of complexities, and I find myself sometimes really scratching my head at how hard it is, for the operators to kind of navigate, various rulings and, not so crystal clear laws. And so I think that'll be a great panel. And then, we're going to do another one that I think also really important for the industry. And it's going to, really kind of focus on, how can you as an owner, as an operator, be prepared for a cyber attack. Again, something that I think we all wish we weren't, talking about, as an organization or an industry or as a country. But, I think we all know that, that there are things that there are bad actors out there, and these bad actors target all different types of businesses, all different sizes, and so we've got I think a really good practical discussion for owners or operators about how can you try and mitigate cyber risk, and we've got both an operator. We've got Bob Mercer from Cedarbrook Senior Living. He'll be kind of guiding that discussion from the operations perspective, and then we have a guy named Chris Lair, who is with Solis Security, so he's a tech guy. And then we've got Jevin Backman from Propel Insurance, and obviously they're right in the middle of these types of issues. And so, again, not a topic that anyone really can afford to not pay attention to. I think that'll be a really good one for us too. And then we'll kind of wrap things up with, a discussion that's going to really focus on, how do we use data and AI to advance senior living? And I know that gets a lot of folks thinking about it, talking about it. I think we've got a really good panel. We've got a guy named Jeffrey Baum who teaches at Arizona State. He's a really, really interesting guy. He has a very unique perspective. He's a researcher. He's a tech guy. He's got a incredible business understanding, and he's also got a parent who has lived in senior living for around a decade, and he has been actively involved in her care. So whereas some academics wouldn't know assisted living from a train station, he knows it intimately, different communities. And so he's got a really unique perspective on that. So, we try and cover a lot of ground. The meeting is basically a day and a half. But that's kind of the lineup. And I think we have, a lot of really terrific sessions lined up for everybody.
Well, you always do an action-packed ASHA, and I know our listeners are thinking, oh my gosh, many of them are like, I haven't booked my hotel yet. I've got to do that. It's just a little over a month, January 27th, 29th, Phoenix at the Biltmore. And then there's going to be so many that they're thinking, why have I not been part of this, either as sponsoring this so I could be there with the relationship building, networking, and all the education and information and these great speakers that you have. So there's a host of people that I'm sure are going to be inquiring on the site. Lucas, I can't wait to be out in Phoenix. It's such a beautiful place, and it's always great to see our industry friends and professionals getting together to talk about the industry we love so much.
Very much so. Dave, thank you so much for taking time with us today. We look forward to seeing you in a few weeks here in January.
My pleasure. It's always fun to visit with you. And again, I just want to reiterate, ASHA really appreciates Bridge the Gap, and always enjoy listening and participating in your conversations. And you guys are really great ambassadors for the industry. So thank you both. And we'll look forward to seeing you in a few weeks.
We really appreciate that coming from you, Dave. And for our listeners that want to learn more, scroll down to the podcast notes, hit those links to connect with ASHA. You can go to btgvoice.com, download this content and so much more. Thanks for listening to another great episode of Bridge the Gap.
Thanks for listening to Bridge the Gap podcast with Josh and Lucas. Connect with the BTG Network team and use your voice to influence the industry by connecting with us at btgvoice.com.